Hi, I'm Mike Hogue. I've been a permaculture designer, plantsman, gardener for over 20 years, which means that I love critiquing permaculture. Critiquing permaculture is like our favorite pastime in permaculture. It's our favorite topic of conversation, bashing permaculture. And I was told that this article, this history of permaculture by Proles, is a great example of permaculture bashing, and so I'm here for it. I am up for a critique of permaculture. Now, I was told that it was a critique, but it also looks like it's a history. I did a longer video of reading through this live where we can break that down. In this one, I'm just going to look at the parts of this that I've identified as critiques. There are 5 critiques in this that I've identified of permaculture, and let's talk about them. Now, the first of these critiques is right here, that part of the attraction of permaculture comes from its broad strokes ethics, which leave much to the interpretation of the end user. Now, we permaculturists, our second favorite thing to talk about is bashing the ethics. In fact, permaculture's ethics have changed consistently like all the time since its beginning. They started as one thing. Holmgren published a completely different set of 3 ethics. Other people have torn out some of them, bashed some of them. There's a huge process of different iterations of the permaculture ethics over 40 years. I myself have my own critique of them, so there's something kind of valid there, but there's also this idea that the permaculture ethics have been under this kind of constant scrutiny and development over time. Maybe they're not perfect, but they serve a purpose. But are they really an important part of the popularity of permaculture? We can quantify that part. I dropped a bunch of search terms including permaculture ethics into Google Trends, and you can barely even see the permaculture ethics compared to other permaculture search terms. So it's, I don't actually think that the ethics are a huge important part of introducing people to permaculture. I think like Toby Hemingway said, people come to permaculture through the garden gate. Once they're there, that's when we learn how to love enjoying bashing the ethics. In other words, I think that permaculture stands is vitally important whether or not the ethics stand or fall or transform over time. They deserve critique, but we shouldn't toss the baby with the bathwater. Critique 2, permaculture absorbs other concepts into its broader systems concept, including organics, biodynamics, no-till, and so on, essentially claiming them for permaculture Spain, so that permaculture's popularity is based on the popularity of these other things. Essentially, that it co-opts other fields. I think this critique fails to understand the whole very point of permaculture and what permaculture is. This is like the third favorite thing for permaculturists to argue about. In fact, you can't pick up a book about permaculture and read a chapter without seeing that permaculturists always repeat again and again and again that permaculture is not the things in here, these different techniques. Permaculture is like this really cool closet that organizes and helps you select and find the best techniques to meet your values while also engaging you with thinking about your values and what your goals are. Permaculture ain't the stuff, it's the box, the fancy box that the stuff is handed to you in. Think about it this way. You got a few hours to remodel your living room. Would you rather spend it with a stack of scientific papers on different aspects of what makes a good and sustainable living room, like what kind of floors and walls and everything, what are best? Or would you rather spend that time with a little book that would have a bunch of patterns about what inspiring living rooms could look like that you could go through, and that book, if it's good, would actually synthesize that whole stack of scientific studies, giving you the most important parts, the 20% of that information that will get you the 80% of your value from your living room remodel. That's the idea of permaculture. And at the same time, it tries to be careful in pointing out that permaculture is not actually necessarily the stuff hanging in the closet. Bill Mollison used to always say that himself. Here he is in his last interview, pointing out that somebody told me their grandmother practiced permaculture because she had a just and sustainable lifestyle, right, and grew her own food. And he makes a joke of it, so did my grandma. But that's not permaculture. Permaculture is something entirely different. It has to deal with money and legal structure and how we set up those things and how we deal with the efficiency of our houses and our settlements. Your grandmother never had to deal with that, because she lived in a society with a just and sustainable lifestyle. We now do not. We have a historical context where we've lost those things and we have to recreate them. And this pattern language idea is the way to do it. But Bill Mollison always says, considering all these different things, permaculture is just laziness. It's not any of the techniques or organic techniques for gardening or farming. It is the system we use to think about them and make choices. We could call this idea a pattern language or pattern design concept idea. And it's actually now considered a scientific best practice, one of the best ways we have to inform DIYers about how to make better choices without them having to get like PhDs in a bunch of different topics, right? Now, most critics of permaculture have not even taken the time to understand that, but at least this one mentions the pattern language concept. Although he doesn't mention that whole idea, that the whole point of it was that Christopher Alexander was tasked with trying to figure out how to get DIYers and people across disciplines to make better architectural choices without them having to read a bunch of architecture studies, getting that 20% to get the 80% of the results he wanted. The pattern language concept was the tool he came up with to do that job. Now, this points out that a lot of it hasn't been adopted by professional architects, and that's probably true. He probably was not very good at figuring out what his actual audience was for this, but it's been very influential on those fields, like the existence of design books and stuff like that. What he does critique is the idea that a pattern language does not have a historical context, and says that neither does permaculture. So the critique is that permaculture lacks this historical context, and it's too bad that he does not try to support that at all, because this is actually a really interesting point to develop a critique around. Now, of course, permaculture does have an extremely sophisticated and well-developed set of books and everything and resources about the historical context and how we got here, and this whole iterative thought history about what we do about it now that we're here. In fact, one could say that that is exactly what permaculture is and intended to be, is recognizing where we are, how we got here, and how to get out of it. That's what permaculture is. It's all about that historical context. Now, we could argue over whether or not that permaculture context could be improved, whether or not it's valid, and we could critique that. But that isn't done here. There's actually no attempt to support that idea. And that's a shame, because I would love to see that debate. As a guy who loves to critique permaculture, this actually seems interesting. I think permaculture could be improved by having an even better understanding of its historical context, where we've been and where we're going. But he says it's not there at all. I see no support for that. Now, all I can say to support my side of things is listen to a Bill Mollison talk, listen to one of his PDCs, read the designer's manual. He spends an extreme amount of time talking. It was one of his favorite topics, was talking about the historical context and how we got here. Critique number 4 is that permaculture lacks an iterative process, which means it, unlike a science like Indigenous or Western science, they have ways, like the scientific method, or in Indigenous societies, everything, you repeat something every year, that becomes like a set of experiments. And through those experiments, we can make a thing better. It has different iterations, it improves over time. Here, the critique is that permaculture lacks an iterative process, which is actually really funny, because in talking about this article, we repeatedly see again and again and again permaculture's iterative process. We see it with the ethics, for example, that the ethics started with one thing, they developed over time. In this, he points out other examples, things that Mollison would say one year and then say something different 20 years later. He characterizes this as a personality flaw, like Mollison was just shifty. But that's the iterative process. But that's not where the iterative process in permaculture ends, because permaculture as a pattern language draws from the research literature. I have videos on the top 10 most common patterns from permaculture in actual use. All of them are research-based practices with good research on them. There's an iterative process there. That brings us to the 5th critique in here, which is basically its relationship to Indigenous rights. And he actually starts by talking about some of the debate within the permaculture community about that. And in fact, he quotes me in one of my critiques of permaculture. Again, that's the iterative process. That's us within permaculture having this history of debate and evolution and change over time, improvement over time in permaculture. So he doesn't really add a lot to it in this case, but he does then state that the argument that Bill Mollison gives credit to Aborigine as at the beginnings of his books, I don't know why it has to be in the beginnings of his books, but in his books, isn't backed by any evidence. Then he goes on to actually point out there is evidence from Permaculture 1 and Permaculture 2, but he does not mention the Permaculture Designer's Manual at all, because that wouldn't support his argument. The Permaculture Designer's Manual, when you pick it up, the thing on the cover is actually an Aboriginal symbol, and when you open it up and you read the cover story, it is talking about how it is based in an Aboriginal people's philosophy. When you look at the cover of permaculture design, it's a credit to Indigenous peoples and Aboriginal peoples of Australia. When he introduces one of the most important parts of the permaculture design process, the principles, he gives those credit to Australian Aborigines too, even though a lot of them are worded from scientists. Instead, he says, for every scientific statement articulated on energy, the Aboriginal tribes people of Australia have an equivalent statement on life. Of course, he couldn't credit every single part of permaculture to Aboriginal people because Aboriginal people didn't create every part of permaculture. And finally, in what is considered the thesis paragraph of the whole Permaculture Designer's Manual, which is also the curriculum for the Permaculture Design Certificate course, permaculture's most important book, the thesis statement is, I believe that unless we adopt sophisticated Aboriginal belief systems and learn respect for all life, then we will lose our own, not only as a lifetime, but as any future opportunity to evolve our potential. In other words, the point to permaculture is for us to re-indigenize, and that people like Australian Aborigines are our models. Now, was this as clear in Permaculture 1 and Permaculture 2? No. That's the iterative process again. Permaculture changed and it grew. We can't judge permaculture, if we want to be fair and honest, by what it was in 1980 or 1978. We have to judge it by what it is today. And by the designer's manual, permaculture had taken huge leaps towards this. It's very convenient that he left off the best evidence against his point. So I was a guy who loves critiquing permaculture. I have to admit, I'm a little bit disappointed by these critiques, mainly because they're stated out there, thrown out there as hypotheses, but then he does not attempt to support any of those statements or build evidence for those claims. He just throws them out as though they are self-evident and true, when if you actually look at them, it would be pretty hard to support those claims, given the evidence that we've looked at, as being supportable claims. I'm most interested in that third critique about the historical context, because there is always so much room to build better historical context and praxis and understanding for how permaculture could be improved and move forward in the future. But unfortunately, this article didn't attempt to actually do that, which was a little disappointing. I hope maybe in the future we see people turning their attention towards that again. I know my books and my critiques of permaculture do develop that, and it's something I'll continue to work on in my next books. Anyway, let me know if I missed anything in there that I should talk about, and thanks for watching.